Good evening, blog viewers. Tonight we'll continue, or finish, I think, with John Cooper's excellent book, Pursuits of Wisdom. And so far we've covered the Socratic way of life, the Aristotelian way of life, and also the Epicurean way of life. Today we will look at the Stoic way of life and make certain remarks about that, and then tie it into the virtue of work, because I think the ideas on the Stoic way of life actually fit best with what is probably the best way to work in today's modern world. Now, for the Stoics, and again, for the majority of this lecture, I'm going to be summarizing Cooper's ideas on the Stoic way of life loosely, not in all particulars, but in the core attributes. For the Stoics, as for the Aristotelian way of life, the life where we are living virtuously in accordance with many of the virtues of human life is the highest human good for a human being. That is the life which, for the Stoics, was the happiest life, and it was a life that where we exercise the virtues not over one day or 1 week or one season, but over the course of an entire life. Living virtuously, then, specifically for the Stoics, living virtuously was living in agreement. A phrase they use, living in agreement with oneself, and living in agreement with nature, or what they also called the synonyms they used for nature was the world mind or the god Zeus. And nature, the world mind, or Zeus, we'll just call it the world mind for the rest of this lecture. The world mind operated upon the entire universe, all matter, all things, all objects, and it continually operated and created these things and maintained them in a way to cause the world to be, and the whole universe to be, just as it is. That was the function of the world mind. The world mind's capability of thought was infinitely greater, infinitely more expansive, infinitely more minute than the thought of any human being. The world mind has millions and almost billions of thoughts in its brain as it's continuing to think about every single animal, every plant, the weather, various natural phenomenon. It's thinking and producing all of these things, the Stoic thought, in producing the world that we go into every day and the world that we live in. And again, so for the Stoics, a human being would live virtuously so long as one lived in agreement with oneself and one lived in agreement with this world mind. And we'll have various remarks as to later on in the post as to what this actually means. Conversely, for the Stoics, living badly was living unhappily, was living not in agreement with oneself or the world mind. Those types of lives where one was living not in agreement were rather poor lives, the Stoics thought. And as opposed to the Aristotelian way of life, which believed that the practice of the moral virtues required certain states of feeling, certain emotional dispositions toward acting in certain sorts of ways, certain emotional dispositions that cause one to delight in virtue and want to become virtuous. The Stoics thought that virtue was strictly a matter of thinking. Emotion for the Stoics had a very limited role in the virtuous life. A stoically virtuous person perfected sort of his philosophical thinking of what it would mean to live in agreement with nature, what it would mean to live in agreement with the world mind, what it would mean to live in agreement with oneself, and thought and continued to refine those ideas in a way that he or she learned how to act, learned how to value things, and learned correctly, and learned what was really good for a human being. The Stoics frequently distinguished between what was actually good for a human being and what was only merely of some value for a human being, merely of some use value or some other value, but not fundamentally good in and of itself. And for the Stoics, most things actually were only of some value. Most things that most people pursue, the subjects we've talked about frequently in the blog: money, various bodily pleasures, reputation, power, all of the typical pursuits of day-to-day living that most people are pursuing. Those things the Stoics thought were only of some value. They could be of some good value, they could be of some bad value for some people, but in general they were of some value, but they were not in and of themselves good. And one of the key attributes for the stoically virtuous person was to correctly distinguish between what was actually good and bad for a human being and what was only of some value. The Stoics thought that if someone was to make a mistake on that key issue, a central issue of human life, and mistake what was only of some value for a human being with what was actually good or bad for a human being, then that fundamental decision there that was mistaken would cause would lead to various other mistakes and various other ways of living that was not in agreement with nature, not in agreement with oneself, and produced a great form of unhappiness for the human being that mistook or conflated something that was of value for something that was actually good. And so, specifically on the emotions and why the Stoics thought the emotions were not actually that good in and of themselves. The emotions are to be felt by a Stoic only to the extent that reason has sort of agreed and accepted the calibrated response to a calibrated expression of the emotion that would be appropriate. The Stoics thought that in general the expression of emotion had to be sort of calibrated by reason. A good example would be a father that sort of sees that sees his son, newborn son, for the first time. Obviously, reason for the Stoics would say that would be an instance where one should delight, one should be very happy and joyous, and so therefore the Stoic would then express those emotions. So the Stoic was not an emotionless, dull, artificial creature, but he was someone that reason was sort of regulating the emotion, and reason was producing the appropriate amount of emotion in the appropriate circumstances. Now, the Stoics, because they viewed reason as really reason and rational thought as being the fundamental activity of virtue, and did not view emotions as having a very important place in virtue at all, they thought in general that emotions had no place. The strength of an emotion and the emotions by themselves were a very poor basis to act in a certain sort of way. An action that was motivated by nothing but pure emotion, totally disconnected from any rational idea that this thing was actually good or worth pursuing in some sort of way, that was sort of a mistaken way of acting for the Stoics. They thought always that the intensity of the emotion by itself was no reason to actually pursue something or act in a certain sort of way. Again, reason and reason thinking of that activity as actually being virtuous and worth pursuing was the only reason to go ahead and do something. In addition to that, the Stoics thought that most things that most people got upset about or expressed emotions about really were not things that reason would tell us we should get very upset about. And the Stoics stressed the need for sort of daily philosophical training and study and reflection on what was actually good for a human being and what was only of some value, as they thought. If one did this sort of activity repetitively, then one would then come to the conclusion of the Stoics that the things that are actually worth reason would tell us would be appropriate to get emotional about, or would be appropriate to express a strong emotion, would in fact be quite limited, and perhaps and even if it was limited, limited in the number of things we should properly express emotion for, even the extent of how long or how intense the emotional reaction should be, that in itself should be limited. So again, going back back to the example of the father that sees his newborn for the first time, it would of course be appropriate for the father to express emotion. But even there, reason would put some limit on how long. One shouldn't delight in that fact for 5 years and do nothing but sort of post pictures of one's child all over the Facebook, or constantly talk about the joy of a new child. I mean, to some extent, that would then become, for the Stoic, I think, excessive. That would be an excessive amount of emotion expressed over something that in its core was still appropriate to express emotion over. And so only through this sort of daily philosophical reflection and training and contemplation and refinement and correct philosophical activity did the Stoic think we could make appropriate distinctions as to what is actually good and bad for a human being, and what is only of some value. And the Stoics believed, I guess one way to structure this would be, why did the Stoic believe that most things are not worth the sort of intense, most things that happen in the world, why are they not worth the intense emotional reaction that most people commonly express over these events that happen? Why is it that most things are not worth getting very emotional about? And I think for the Stoics, this requires us to sort of understand an idea they had, a complicated set of ideas they had about the operations of this world mind, and in creating the world and maintaining the world, and then also humans' contribution alongside the world mind. And in general, the Stoics thought that the world mind, being this infinitely complex, infinitely powerful dimension of reason, or rational mind, this mind continually operated in a very complex way that human beings had only a very limited capability to understand, very limited capability to produce a total world, not just a specific portion of the world or a specific city or a specific home or a specific person, but the world mind was operating at a much higher level of generality. It was not concerned with specific places or specific countries or cultures or anything, but the world mind was acting in a way to continually create a world that was maximally good, maximally well ordered, maximally beautiful, maximally varied and interesting, and for lack of a better word, just a purely awesome world. This was what the world mind was continuing to create and maintain as the course of human history and world history continued. The world mind continued to produce this world that was interesting and beautiful and complex and varied, and in general, the world as a whole, not any specific aspect of the world. And as partners, and the Stoics believe that individual human beings could only, of course, have very limited understanding of what the world mind was doing, or the world it was creating and maintaining. But nevertheless, even though we had a very limited understanding, human beings could be partners with this world mind in working to contribute to this effort of the world mind in creating a very beautiful, diverse, interesting, good world. We could be partners in that quest. We, of course, our contributions would be very, very small compared to what the world mind was doing and operating, because the world mind is infinitely more powerful, infinitely smarter, and infinitely more filled with thoughts than we are. But still, we could make some contribution to the world mind and the beauty of the world. And I think in this sense, in comparing the small contribution we could make to the very large contribution of the world mind, I'm reminded of something that Harold Bloom said in an interview when he was asked why he continued to write about the great classics of literature, despite the fact that the work seems to be never ending. And he said that, I think he was quoting Hebrew scripture, and he said that in general he felt that, or he was quoting Hebrew scripture to the effect that one is not required to complete the work, but neither is one neither is one permitted to stop working or to desist from the work. So we can never finish the work. We can never act in the same ways or produce the same sort of powerful results as the world mind, but we still have an obligation to contribute in some way, shape, or form. Or according to the Stoics, we should, if we're virtuous, we should feel this desire and this obligation and this need to want to contribute to the beauty of a maximally good, maximally interesting world. And now, so if one accepts this as being our obligation as stoically virtuous people to contribute to the beauty and the variation and the maximally good world that the world mind is continuing to operate and create, how do we go about doing that? What are the things that we should do? And I think the Stoic theory is a little vague in sort of the particulars as to what we should do beyond living virtuously. But for example, they don't say, you should be a lawyer rather than a doctor or a businessman or a politician or anything like that sort. But beyond sort of the injunction that we should live in agreement with ourselves and in agreement with the world mind, the Stoics, I think, believe that to make this sort of contribution to the efforts of the world mind required two very important things. First, we had to act in ways that to contribute to the beauty and goodness of the world, we had to obviously stay healthy and be virtuous and remain rationally sharp. I think those are key ideas in the ideas of the Stoics. And to do that, to remain healthy, virtuous, and rationally sharp, this required us to be sort of moderate in our pursuit of various pleasures and to obviously continue to live virtuously and continue to work on philosophy and different ideas as to what is actually good for a human being. These things were very important because for the world mind, if we were to stop, for example, if we were to neglect virtue or neglect acting in ways that continue to refine our ideas of what was good versus of some value, we would then fall away from being in agreement with oneself or in agreement with the world mind. So the Stoic life was in many ways a life of moderation, a life of, again, virtuous activity, and also remaining philosophically and rationally sharp. Beyond that, when we act, the second key point for the Stoics was when we act to actually make some contribution to the world and to the world mind's efforts to create this maximally good world, we must always accept and know that whatever effort we make, however hard we try, however good intentioned the effort may be, however well thought out it may have been, however rational it seemed when we started out doing whatever it is we were doing, given all that, we could still fail. Why? Because our faculties are limited, our powers are limited, and the operations of the world mind and all human actors and all human forces and all natural forces in the world are infinitely more complex and greater than anything that we can do. So while we have that duty under the Stoic philosophy to make a contribution to the goodness of the world and to the maximal goodness of the world mind's efforts, we must always understand we can fail. And this recognition must be, as soon as we fail, we must recognize under the Stoic theory that our failure was part of the world mind's full efforts to bring about a maximally good world. The world mind continued to act in ways that is bringing about the maximal goodness of the world, and even our failure in that respect, whenever we tried to do something and we failed, that was part of the world mind's plans, and we should accept it and move on to the next project, move on to the next contribution of what we can make to this beauty of this maximally good world that continues to get created by the world mind and maintained. In this philosophy, there is absolutely no place in the Stoic philosophy for any sort of bitterness, any sort of anger, any sort of retaliation, any sort of brooding, any sort of long drawn-out depression, any sort of moping and pessimism as to why one's particular contribution or intended contribution to the maximally goodness of the world, maximal goodness and beauty of the world mind's efforts failed. that would be totally out of place. We must accept that the beauty and the goodness of the world mind's efforts, of which we can only know in such a small way, included as part of its plans, that whatever contribution we sought to make end up in failure, and that we continue on to the next project and make some further contribution at that point. And so whatever happens when we try something, or when we try to make some contribution, whatever happens, good or bad, is part of the world mind's efforts. It's part of the world mind's plan, I think Cooper says, for a beautiful course of events. We obviously thought we were doing the right thing. We thought we were making a good contribution, but it turned out we were wrong, and we have to accept the world mind's efforts. So we should always be content under this view of the Stoic philosophy of life. We should always be content however things turn out, so long as we acted virtuously, so long as we acted in a full committed manner. We tried our best. We gave we activated and used all our faculties, our human faculties, to bring about this contribution that we sought to make. We sought to make the contribution as part of an effort to contribute to the world mind's efforts in creating a maximally good world. Despite all that, we failed, but nevertheless, we accept the result. We move on to the next contribution, and I think the key is this moving on. I think didn't quite see Cooper mentioning this as much. Pretty sure he would agree with it, but the key point is, once we do fail at whatever contribution we sought to make, human life is continuing. We are continuing to exist. The world mind is continuing to produce a maximally good result. The duty we had, the duty that we should have had or should have felt to make some contribution to the goodness of the world, doesn't end just because we failed at whatever initial project we conceived of as being a contribution to the world mind. That duty still exists. The world mind's efforts to create the maximally good world still exist, and therefore we need to continue to rise beyond any moping or brooding. Maybe we brood for a day or two or a weekend or whatever, but we quickly get it out of our system, and we then move on to the next. We move on to the next contribution we can make. That was, for the Stoics, the philosophy of life. That was a key component of their of what it meant to live virtuously, in agreement with oneself, in agreement with the plans of the world mind, and ultimately to live a happy, flourishing human life. And so I think we've summarized now in essential attributes the Stoic philosophy of life, and I'm not going to make this very long because I think it's so straightforward. I think this is actually a very good philosophy for work. I think the ways to work in ways that ways to approach a working career of many years, of 30, 40 years, or however long we work. This is a philosophy that requires us to, first of all, want to make some contribution to the goodness of the world. So we would, first of all, choose particular work or occupations that we actually thought were contributing some goodness to the maximal goodness of the world. Not just some occupation or career that sort of offered us the most money, or was some way that we thought we could gain a lot of power and reputation, because those things in themselves, power, reputation, or wealth for an individual person, is not in itself a specific contribution to the goodness of the world mind. So we should first focus on making through our work, some contribution to the beauty and maximal variety and diversity of the world mind's efforts to create a maximally good world. Now, I don't think this at all requires us to be a philosopher. I think you could be an artist, someone of some a politician, a community activist, a yoga instructor, various sorts of ways you can contribute, because the world mind's efforts to bring about a maximally good world did not just require the production of a world that was maximally rational. It was a world that was not just rational, but good and interesting and beautiful and harmonious and varied and well-ordered. So these required various sorts of contributions for different people to make, and different sorts of contributions. Perhaps a symphony, or we could set out to write a symphony, a wonderful novel, various sorts of contributions. But beyond that, we should second point, I guess we should try to make this contribution in the fully virtuous way, and understand that again, our whatever we are seeking to contribute, that is the goodness of whatever the activity is we are doing. Anything else from work that may flow out from our efforts to make a contribution to the maximal goodness of the world mind's efforts, those things, any wealth or power or reputation, those things should be viewed as some value to us, but not in themselves good, in the same sense that making that contribution or being a partner with the world mind's effort should be viewed as good. That is the only thing that I think the Stoics thought should be viewed as good, and I think there are some fundamental there is a fundamental correctness, I think, to that beyond whatever we get from work, at a very deep level, what is actually virtuous about work, what is actually fulfilling about work, if done correctly, is making that contribution to the goodness of the world, to the goodness to the interesting variety of the world, and to the diversity of the world. And that is the number one thing. All the other things that flow out of that, they're of some value for some other reason, but the fundamental goodness of work resides in just that activity. I think that the Stoics were right to identify. And I think lastly, the Stoics were keenly sensitive and cognizant in very important ways of how difficult it is, despite very good intentions, despite talents, someone having talents for a specific activity, despite one having passion for an activity, despite all of that, the Stoics were very aware how difficult it is to actually contribute in a specific way to the world and actually further that contribution. We can try our best to contribute, but once we make that maximal effort, it's sort of up to whether you want to call it the world mind, the operation of nature, the luck, various forces out of our control. All of these things play such a huge part in whether whatever contribution we're seeking to make is actually fulfilled, whether we actually write that great novel that's read by everyone, whether we actually create that new school of yoga that becomes the most popular thing, whether we are able to open a sort of a fashion designing school that becomes the most popular, whether we're able to become, the conductor of a large metropolitan symphony orchestra. All these things, these are all well-intentioned efforts to create or to add beauty and goodness to the world, but ultimately I think it is quite difficult to achieve a lot of these things, and there needs to be a proper recognition that even though we made our best efforts, we can fail, and even in the failure there may be some goodness in it. There's we may learn certain things, we may realize we didn't really want that sort of thing, and we can then focus our efforts on our next sort of project for adding to the goodness of life. And that project will just continue and continue throughout the course of our lives. And whatever contributions we make at some point to the beauty of the world through our work will always be there and will never be taken away. And in some way, shape, or form, in ways that, again, the Stoics were, I think, right to say, no single human mind can see sort of the grand order and beauty of the world as it's operating. We should always be aware of that, pursue our contributions with vigor, but also understand that we have there is still beauty in the world, and there's still goodness in the world that we can contribute, even if particular contributions fail at one point or another. So I think that's it for today. I've not critiqued the ideas as much as I normally do, but I think these ideas really don't need as much critique or amplification. So I guess we'll finish this now. Bye-bye.